Welcome to our fourth talk on the face of love. As you recall, last week we focused on numbers 9 through 12 of the Holy Father's papal bull, Misericordia Vultus. And these numbers spoke principally about two things. It was talking about the foundation, mercy as the foundation of the Church's life. And then towards the end, we especially focused on where are the places in the Church where we find mercy especially present. The sources of mercy, as John Paul II referred to them, and they are especially in the sacraments. This week we're going to move on towards numbers 13 through 15, and we're going to be talking about what are some of the elements of mercy. And going right into the Holy Father's document, the Holy Father points out the logo and the motto. As you recall, we've spoken about the logo several different times, but we have the picture of Christ carrying the man over his shoulders, and we have the fact that they share that common eye, Christ who looks at the world with the human eye, and mankind who looks at through the eyes of God, through that experiencing encounter of mercy. But right next to that image, we see the words on the side of this kind of oval, merciful like the Father. That is the real theme of this year. And it comes from the gospel text of Luke chapter 6, verse 27, when Jesus tells us, "Be merciful as your heavenly Father is merciful." Now, Pope Francis tells us, in order to be capable of mercy, therefore, we must first of all dispose ourselves to listen to the Word of God. This means rediscovering the value of silence in order to meditate on the word that comes to us. In this way, it will be possible to contemplate God's mercy and adopt it as our lifestyle. I don't know about you, but I don't know if you were to describe your life, I think it would be curious to see how many of you out there would include the word mercy or silence somewhere in that definition. If you were to talk about what your life is like in general, how many of you would use the word silence to define it? Probably none of us. We live in a world that is increasingly filled with a lot of noise, a lot of distractions, a lot of things that are perpetually kind of drawing our attention. You know, when I was a kid, the concept, for example, when it was time to do homework, of having a computer next to me and a cell phone and messages coming in, it simply wasn't an option. We had a phone on the wall, and that was it. Somebody either knocked on your door or called the house telephone. Those were the options. I didn't have messages beeping and what have you. And this is something I noticed when I was a newly ordained priest. I went to the Philippines in the year 2006. Now, in 2006, that was roughly the time when smartphones were getting smart, when that stuff was getting started. Social media existed, it is true. Facebook was already up and running, for example, and kids were using it. But I noticed a difference. The kids that I first started working with were quite different from actually the kids only 5 years later. By the time 2010, 2011, 2012 rolled around, I already noticed there's a big difference in the kids that I'm dealing with. What was it? I noticed, frankly, their attention span was reduced. And what is the reason? It's pretty simple. Like I said, when I arrived to the Philippines, social media existed. But the kids that were using social media had not grown up with it. They were not born with it. It's something they adopted later in life. So it hadn't totally shaped their way of looking at the world, their way of interacting. Smartphones existed, they were beginning, but the kids hadn't grown up with it. They didn't have instant reflexes and reactions, for example, to be taking selfies. I don't even know if the word selfie existed when I arrived in 2006. So we live in a world where rapidly there is more and more noise, there's more and more distraction if we're not careful. And with each one of these advances in technology, I found our kids were getting more and more wired in, and they were more and more conscientious of sharing their experiences. But I also noticed they're more and more distracted. They have more and more of an inclination to try to focus on doing 10 different things at once. And in the end, they have less of a capacity to focus on only one given thing at a time. Now, what is the result? I was dealing with kids that are still nice kids. They were good kids. But these are kids that had a really hard time listening. Now, if you have a hard time listening to a physical, living, breathing human being in front of you, how are we going to be able to listen to a God who is mysterious, who speaks in silence to our hearts? It's a challenge. And the Holy Father is telling us, unless we have spaces of silence, unless we create a climate of silence in our lives, we're not going to be able to hear the Father speaking to us in sacred scripture, in prayer, in our consciences. So we need these spaces. We need to create spaces in our lives. Now, I think this is something, it requires a lot of discipline. I am the first one, as a priest even, I'm the first one who has to fight this fight. But what are some of the things we can do? What are some practical things we can do? Well, for starters, we don't always need to have a TV on. It is good to perhaps budget our use of time for television. We need to have sacred spaces, for example, where gadgets are not allowed. Family time where gadgets simply are not allowed. And for certainly when we are praying, we need to have spaces where there are no gadgets, no distractions, nothing that's going to interrupt us. You know, it's a funny thing. Before I arrived here in New York, one of our priests was telling us, because he had also come to our community from the United States, and he told us, he said, you know, in the US, seemingly, there's a business practice now. When there is a business lunch, you go out to a restaurant, what happens? Everybody pulls out their cell phone, they stick it in the middle. And if anybody goes for their phone, answers their phone, needs to send a message, does anything like that during the lunch, they pay for it. It's their way of holding each other accountable. This time is for us. This is not a time where everybody sits down, we start pulling out, checking our messages, halfway listening to the other. To have quality time with a person means we need to be able to give that person undivided attention. And this is something actually I also discovered just the other day with some of our own JCC kids. Teenage kids, these are high schoolers. And during one of the meetings, one of the girls was saying, we need to learn, for example, to use airplane mode. When we are praying, and this was a high school kid talking to other high school kids, saying, we have to be capable of turning off our phones so that we can pray. I was so proud of her. To hear that from a 16-year-old kid, we have to learn to turn off our phones so that we can pray. The second thing that the Holy Father recommends is, he uses the word pilgrimage. Well, what's he referring to? He says the practice of pilgrimage has a special place in the Holy Year because it represents the journey that each of us makes in life. Now, is the Pope telling us we all need to go to Fatima or Lourdes or Guadalupe or something like that during the Holy Year? That would be great if we could all do that, but of course he knows we cannot. He's not expecting us all to go to St. Peter's and go through that holy door. But one of the practices of any Jubilee year is every diocese has certain churches, always the cathedral for one, and perhaps other basilicas or other churches or sanctuaries of special importance that each bishop will name that have a special holy door. And only during the Jubilee year will that door be open. And that's where we get the indulgence. So, the practice of going out of our way, of having a special day, a special time, we're going to go out of our way to visit that church, to walk through that door. That is a kind of a pilgrimage, and it has a very powerful symbolic value. The Holy Father says, this holy door will be a sign that mercy, or this pilgrimage rather, will be a sign that mercy is also a goal to reach and requires dedication and sacrifice. So the idea that we are on a journey, that mercy is a goal we have to arrive to, It's symbolized by the fact that we are walking or traveling to the door of mercy to receive the indulgence of mercy from Christ. And secondly, he says, it is an impetus to conversion. By crossing the threshold of the holy door, the Holy Father says, we will find the strength to embrace God's mercy and dedicate ourselves to being merciful with others as the Father has been with us. Now, the Holy Father, we know that it's not enough for us to follow a couple of pious practices, as beautiful as they be. The holy door, for example, is there for a reason. The Holy Father uses the word conversion, an impetus to conversion. Well, what is the kind of conversion that Pope Francis is looking for in this year of mercy? The Holy Father outlines some steps of conversion, and the first one is as simple as it is difficult. It is basically avoid judgment. We know that in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 6, verse 37, Christ himself tells us, "Judge not, and you will not be judged. Condemn not, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be poured into your lap. For the measure you give will be the measure you get back." It's actually a frightening thing to think about. The measure that we give to others is the measure we're going to get back. How many of us, according to the way we live our lives, would be excited to think that that's the way God is going to treat us? If we love with magnanimity, we're going to receive mercy with magnanimity. So the Holy Father says, he breaks this down into 4 different things. First of all, the Lord asks us above all not to judge, not to condemn. It's very simple. The problem is, it is so easy to judge. I'm going to give you a little bit of practical advice. You know, for so many of us, it is easy, for example, to fall into chismes, to fall into gossip. Where does that come from? Well, basically, we're judging. And a lot of times we go about saying, well, I'm going to work on not gossiping, so I'm going to avoid doing something bad. Gossip is bad, I'm not going to do it anymore. And what happens? You and I already know. We make the resolution not to gossip, and we gossip. A much better way, a much more productive way to avoid gossip is, instead of simply saying, I'm going to avoid saying bad things, is going to rather say, I'm going to say positive things. I'm going to be positive in my judgments of other people. I'm going to go out of my way to see what is good, what is beautiful, what is noble in people, and to speak well of it. And when we do that, or at least when we make that effort, in the process, we find we're not judging them, we're not gossiping, we're not saying bad things anymore. The Holy Father goes on, human beings, whenever they judge, look no farther than the surface, whereas the Father looks into the very depths of the soul. How much harm words do when they are motivated by feelings of jealousy and envy. To speak ill of others puts them in a bad light, undermines their reputation, and leaves them prey to the whims of gossip. So human beings, he says, whenever we judge, we only see what's on the surface. And I think each one of us have had that experience of being judged badly. We've probably all experienced at one point or another, and perhaps many times in our lives, where somebody makes a judgment about us and they really don't know what's going on in the inside. And sad to say, we've probably all been guilty of being the one who makes a judgment and not understanding what's going on the inside of that person. God alone understands, God alone. Perhaps that person themselves doesn't truly understand what's going on in their lives. Our lives can be confusing. Our emotions can be a mix. We can be messed up, so to speak. God is the only one who truly knows to the depths what's going on in our hearts. The Holy Father continues, to refrain from judgment and condemnation means, in a positive sense, to know how to accept the good in every person and spare him any suffering that might be caused by our partial judgment, our presumption to know everything about him. So basically, he's going on to say the same thing, to judge positively, to see what is good. But this is still not sufficient to express mercy. Jesus asks us also to forgive and to give. And again, what are we getting at? It is not enough to avoid doing what is bad. Christ didn't die on a cross to say, go out and do no evil. Christ said, go forth and love. Love one another as I have loved you. Christ doesn't want us to be good people who do no bad. Christ wants us to be saints. So the Holy Father says, forgive and give. Two great, two beautiful, and as always, two very difficult means to live the year of mercy. Well, what are a couple of ways that we can give then? Well, the first thing the Holy Father points out basically comes down to this: to learn to overcome indifference. This one is really rough. Let us not fall into humiliating indifference or a monotonous routine that prevents us from discovering what is new. Let us ward off destructive cynicism. Let us open our eyes to see the misery of the world, the wounds of our brothers and sisters who are denied their dignity, and let us recognize that we are compelled to heed their cry for help. May we reach out to them and support them so they can feel the warmth of our presence, our friendship, and our fraternity. May their cry become our own. And together may we break down the barriers of indifference that too often reign supreme and mask our hypocrisy and egoism. You know, all of us, I think, at one point or another, we see people who are hurting. We see people who are poor. We see people who have needs. And we have choices to make. And all of us, I think, at one moment or another, perhaps choose to ignore them. We haven't done anything wrong to that person. We haven't insulted them. We haven't hurt them anyway. But we have chosen not to love. How can we overcome that indifference? Well, the Holy Father asks us to return to some practices that are as old as the Church itself. I'm sure all of you, as little kids, when you studied in catechism, you heard about the works of mercy. And during this year of mercy, the Holy Father wants us to really get into and to practice the works of mercy. And I'm going to tell you something. St. Peter's as a parish, you're going to discover soon enough, we're going to dedicate ourselves to offering you, our parishioners, special opportunities to put into practice these works of mercy. What are the works of mercy? Well, there are 14 of them. There are the 7 corporal works of mercy and the 7 spiritual works of mercy. So the corporal works of mercy: to feed the hungry, to give drink to the thirsty, to clothe the naked, to welcome the stranger, to heal the sick, visit the imprisoned, and bury the dead. All of us, of course we have our food pantry here, but all of us, one way or another, I think, can find ways to feed the hungry. All of us can perhaps donate something to help clothe the naked. All of us can welcome the stranger. What does this mean? Does it mean necessarily we have to open up a bedroom for some street person? Not necessarily. But all of us can welcome a person who perhaps does not feel loved. To be somebody who takes in, at least spiritually, a person who is in need. To heal the sick. All of us perhaps can visit people in the hospital. All of us perhaps can donate things that are for sick people. I remember, for example, when we had some terrible flooding in Manila, people lost, entire neighborhoods were wiped out after this one particular flood. And we organized relief missions. We organized different lay people, different church groups, anyone who could, organized lots of little impromptu relief missions. We brought little sacks of food. These people went days without eating or having clean water sometimes. We brought sacks of food. We brought basic needs. We brought clothing because they were cold, they were wet. And then, though, later on, what happened? When the roads started getting opened up and the people were sending food, people were sending rice, at least the people were not starving, but there was a serious need for medicine. And that was a need that wasn't being taken care of. So I remember our particular group, we started, instead of spending money on food, we spent money on things, for example, antifungal powder, medicine, basic medicinal need, antibiotics, because people were getting sick due to the contaminations. And these are things that we can find ways. And the spiritual works of mercy, to counsel the doubtful. Everybody can do this. We all know somebody who is lacking in faith. We all know somebody perhaps who has left the church, or who is Catholic but is acting in a way as if they don't care. We all know somebody who has some issue, if you want, some beef with the church, something that they just don't understand or don't agree with, or just simply don't accept something that the church is teaching. I mean, for example, the Holy Father, even as we speak, there is the Synod on the Families. Everyone has an opinion about it. There are lots of people who don't agree with what the church is teaching. It is our job. Who is going to communicate that message to them if it's not going to be you and me, the people that they know on a day-to-day basis? To instruct the ignorant. We look for volunteers always to help out, for example, with our catechism programs. You can always look into that. If you have time, we have teachers, but they're always looking for assistance. And there are so many opportunities to instruct people in the faith. Admonish sinners. This is difficult. Admonish sinners doesn't mean to pull out a crowbar and whack people over the head. It means to extend mercy and to let them know, though, what you are doing is wrong. But I do not condemn you. And Christ doesn't want to condemn you. And I want to give you the opportunity to turn your life around. To comfort the afflicted. All of us know people who are suffering. Forgive offenses. All of us know this. To bear patiently those who do us ill. How many people, how many family scenarios are there where perhaps one family member, one person in the workplace, could be a kid, for example, in school who has a bully. How many scenarios are there out there where one person has to patiently learn to endure treatment that they don't like? And to do it patiently because they recognize, even though this person is treating me in a way that I don't like, I know that that person represents Christ. To pray for the living and the dead. I will tell you something. My own conversion process, I was always born a Catholic, I was raised a Catholic, but I wasn't a particularly active Catholic growing up. What turned me around? When I was leaving high school, I was about ready to start college, one simple idea really struck me. For the first time in my adult life, I took seriously the belief, the idea that there is a heaven, there is a hell. There are people dying in every moment. And people, thousands of people every day, if not millions, who are going to die, and many of whom are going to go to hell. And I can do something about it. By something as simple as my prayers, perhaps fasting, perhaps making visits to the Blessed Sacrament, I can do things that can have an eternal influence for the salvation of souls. That one simple idea was the trigger that God used to start me down a different path and to begin a process that would lead me into the seminary 2 years later and to the priesthood today. So as we said, St. Peter's is going to make a very special effort this year. We're going to try to organize certain activities that are going to allow us to put these works of mercy into practice. But I ask you, please, do not wait for the parish. These corporal works of mercy and spiritual works of mercy aren't things that we should simply wait until the parish does it. Every day we have opportunities. Let's let our lives be characterized by the way we practice and live these works in our daily lives. You know, in the Gospel according to Matthew, when it comes time for the Last Judgment, Christ says he will separate the just people on his right hand and the sinners on his left. And he's going to ask them some questions. And when he asks those on his left, he says, "Away from me, you sinners, into the eternal fire, because I was hungry, you did not feed me. I was thirsty, you did not give me to drink. I was naked, you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison, you did not visit me." Jesus never says, you abused me, you did anything bad to me. Jesus' condemnation comes from the fact that you saw people who were in need and you did nothing. Those are very sobering thoughts. And this is the inspiration, for example, behind a saint like Blessed Teresa of Calcutta. Mother Teresa of Calcutta summarized the entire gospel in 5 words. She calls it her gospel on 5 fingers. You did it to me. Whatever you did to the least of these brothers and sisters, you did to me. So let us be men and women of prayer. Let us be men and women of mercy. And let us go forth this year, taking advantage of every grace that the Church offers us to live this year of mercy. God bless you all.